Welcome to GrrCON 2014, second half of the day. Yay. Hey, what's going on? So today we're going to talk a little bit about purple teams. How many of you have seen this talk before? Anybody? That's great because this is like the fourth time I've given it, and this is the last time I'm going to give it because I'm really tired of giving this talk. Is anyone here a fan of Red versus Blue? You guys remember that YouTube series? Yeah, that's good because there's going to be a lot of Red versus Blue references because talking about red versus blue. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Beltface. That is the reason why. Taken at ShmooCon 2013. And yeah, you can thank Hacker Hunters for that one. I'm also a member of LDN. We're a group, we like to do research, help out with conferences. We have our own conference, Circle CityCon, coming up next year. I work for a Fortune 500 financial institution, doing some InfoSec things, mostly red team, and trying to steal all their money. So if you ever want to get in contact with me, if you're crazy enough or just want to for some reason, that's where I hang out on Freenode, and you can also hit me up on Twitter. So the way we're going to talk about this today is we're going to talk about this in terms of examples. And this first example that we're going to talk about is a hypothetical client that I may or may not have had during my days as a consultant. And in 2013, they were undergoing a merger and acquisition. And one of their biggest fears that they had was that someone on the inside, they were a capital management firm, and they managed something like $15 billion in assets. They were worried, rightfully so, that someone on the inside was going to leak either their Excel documents containing their proprietary data, their passwords, or even just access in for someone to steal all that money. And so they came to us and they said, what sort of policies and procedures should we put in place? How can we implement these? What can we do to protect ourselves? And we kind of thought about it, we talked about it, and we realized we weren't really asking the right questions. They weren't asking the right questions. Everybody had a different answer. The firewall guy said, well, let's put in firewall rules. The IPS guy said, well, hey, I can write a rule for that. The SIM guy said, hey, let's write some heuristics. And the vendors said, hey, we've got this awesome Blinky box that'll solve all your issues. So what we did is we instead said, hey, let's build a program. And where we started was we started with the question why. Now, have any of you guys seen the TED Talk by Simon Sinek? It's called How Great Leaders Inspire Action. If you haven't, I highly recommend seeing it. It's, I think, 15 or 20 minutes, but it's a really great talk. And it revolves around this concept, and I've taken this from his talk, called the Golden Circle. Opa. That sucks. Anyway, it revolves around this concept of the Golden Circle. You ask the question why. You want to know the motivation. And I know that sounds, like some, B-list actor going like, all right, so what's my character's motivation? The director's saying, dude, you're going to buy a latte. Shut up. But seriously, we want to know why why is the bad guy going to target client 0? Well, they want to make money, they want to get in, they want to have persistent access. Well, they might just want to do it for fun. There's skitties out there, and the MSO 8067 is still a very real possibility, hypothetically speaking, at this hypothetical company. And then we also want to ask ourselves, why are they in business? Because if we don't know why they're in business and why they exist, how are we supposed to protect them? How can we build a program around something when we don't even know what we're building or why we're building this program? And that's the thing that I've noticed at a lot of different client sites, is that they don't understand the why when they're building it. They just go to a VAR, they go to a vendor, and they say, hey, give me a Blinky box. They put the Blinky box in place and they think they're secure. And they're really surprised when they find out they're not. So once we know that, we can move on to the how. How am I going to protect them, etc. We also want to know how the bad guy's going to attack. This is where we can kind of get into our threat modeling and that sort of thing. And lastly, this is when we know the what. And if you notice, this is where the action happens, right? Before, we're just planning. We haven't actually done anything. In these two slides, we're just talking and understanding the business until we get to the what. Because until we understand that business, we can't actually know what we're going to protect. What quantifies a critical business service? Is it the servers that they're on? Is it the money? Is it a personal account number? Is it credit card numbers? Is it their reputation? Is it their ability to do business? What qualifies as critical business services? And so until we understand that, we can't do the what. But once we do, we can kind of take that golden circle and turn it into a pyramid. So we build our program on the why. We start with why, we build on top of that why with the how, and then at the top, when we're done understanding, we can put that capstone on it, and we can work with the what. Now, these examples really aren't going to be applicable to everybody. This is a very specific client, and at the end of the presentation, I've added one more example from my current institution. But it's not going to be right for you. But the point is, you want to do something, because if you just sit around all depressed, you're going to be the next Target, you're going to be the next friggin' Home Depot, name a vendor. And that's the hard truth, right? You're going to get breached. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's not FUD, that's the truth. We've been seeing that over and over again. J.J. Guy, in 2001 or 2002, gave a brief called The Assumption of Breach, where he talked about this exact concept. Win Schwartau in 1999 wrote a book called Time-Based Security, which, have any of you guys read that? Time-Based Security? I highly recommend you read it. I saw the guy speak at B-Sides Nashville. Absolutely brilliant talk. It was taking analog electrical engineering concepts and applying it to security. And he does it also with this concept of the PDR. So where P stands for protection, D stands for detection, and R stands for reaction. And so if we look at each one of these as a function of time, so how long will it take the attacker to get to our critical business services? What is our protection value as a function of time? How long will it take us to detect that they've breached our perimeter? How long will it take us to react and cut off their access? So logically, we can say, if the amount of time it takes us to detect that they have breached our perimeter and subsequently react, if that is less than the amount of time that it takes them to achieve their objective, then we can be said to be secure. So when we change the way we think about security to this, it's not so much about keeping them out completely, it's about slowing them down and making it difficult enough so that we have time to detect and react to them. And there's a lot more to the book. I highly recommend you reading it. I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but this is the core concept, and I think it's an excellent concept. So let's define a couple things. I searched definition meme, and this was the first thing that popped up. All right, how many blue teamers do we have in here? Blue team, blue team, blue team, blue team. That's it? All right, how many red teamers do we have? How many people don't self-identify? Fair enough. So our blue teams, when we're talking blue teams, we obviously think of our SIM analysts, we think of our security engineers. What about our network admins? Firewall engineers? Sysadmins? Everybody has a part to play in securing these systems. This is one of my favorite XKCDs of all time. Because it's true, right? We have any sysadmins? Yeah, tell me that's not true. Hate getting those calls at 2 in the morning. But, right, this really shows the whole detect and react mentality that we need to have. So, when we're talking detecting, we're talking preventing, here are some examples. Do we have any students in the audience? That's it. Okay, excellent. So when we're talking detecting and preventing, we want a log monitoring program. So out of you students, how many of you guys have taken a class where they talk about logs and what they mean? And if I say event log 4624, you might not know that offhand, but you know where to go look for it. Good. That's great. That's actually being taught, because when I went through my university program, they didn't talk about logs. Logs are awesome. And I'm biased because that's what I used to do. I used to be a SIM analyst. But they can tell you a lot. And if you haven't already looked into it, ultimatewindowssecurity.com has a great resource on Windows logs and what they mean. And then by preventing, we're talking about having a vulnerability management program. So we're not just scanning with Qualys and Nessus. We're actively going through, we wrap SLAs around them based on whatever metric we can sell to management, whether that's CVSS or Qualys' base scores. And then obviously we've got our ACLs, firewalls, IPS, etc., which, they do stuff. For our detective control, we're going to be talking SIM. And SIM, how many of you guys are familiar with SIM products? How many of you guys who are not professionals are familiar with SIM products? Okay, cool. So if you're not familiar with them, a SIM basically takes in logs from all different sources and correlates them and looks for patterns. And you have to write these patterns. You can't just plug this box in and think that it's going to work. It takes time and effort to tune these. Sometimes it can take upwards of 3, 4, 5 months. It's a constant process. There was a client that I had where we were continuously tuning them over the course of 2 years. And you just have to constantly do it to make sure that it evolves with the evolution of the infrastructure. And then the VM programs. Those give you insight into what's going on. And you can use this to leverage your red team program. So red team. Red teaming is sexy. That's what I moved to. It's a lot of fun. By the way, I'm not saying that I'm sexy in the slightest. I'm just saying, trust me, I know how I look. But the point is that red teaming is just as essential as blue teaming. Blue teaming is just as essential as red teaming. The problem with it is that we look at red teaming as pen testing. And that's it. People do it because it's required as part of audits. Any of you guys do PCI DSS? How many of you guys love PCI DSS? Yeah? No? Alright. But that's why most people do it. They do it because it's required as part of audits. And there's this whole we break it, you fix it mentality that we've kind of been moving away from. But you go in, you pop some boxes and you say, hey, all your shit's broke. Sorry, go fix it. Well, that's great. Aside from all those problems, how do we even know if they did remediate it? How do we know that the remediation works? So that's where we come into security exercises. You take a specific stage in that attack, whether it's persistence, whether it's installation of a backdoor, what have you. You assume all the prior controls that have failed. So you assume that the attacker has been successful up to that point, and then you test it. And you execute it. So let's say you're testing the ability for an attacker to hypothetically install a Meterpreter shell. And you use MSF payload to generate an EXE. And you run it and you say, oh, hey, look, Symantec endpoint protection blocked this. That's great. Now let's try it as a VB script. Oh, wait, it ran it. It didn't even ask me for permission to run it. That's the kind of stuff that you're looking for in this stage. And another cool thing about this is that this isn't just limited and isolated to red team. You can use this to not only inform your incident response teams and your blue teams, you can use this to test them. I mean, how many people have done fire drills? Whether it's at school, work, anything like that, right? Everybody? Yeah. How many of you do fire drills for your incident response teams, if you guys have an incident response team? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's actually more than the last 3 times I've given this talk. Here's the basic difference. We're using real techniques and we're using real objectives in both instances. But when we're exercising, we're modeling the attack. So we don't necessarily have to use Meterpreter. We don't necessarily have to use Metasploit. We could just use Netcat and try and create an outbound connection and see if that works. Because we're testing a specific control as opposed to executing an actual attack and testing the overall posture. Are any of you guys familiar with Cobalt Strike? So I actually started using this very recently. Cobalt Strike is an excellent tool to test with, because it allows you to emulate an attacker. And I was talking with Raph actually just at GrrCON. And that's actually why I started using this and looking into it, because he said this is what the DoD calls threat replication. And what you're doing is you're trying to model what it would look like on the network if an attacker were to have compromised your machine. And you can use these beacons in order to test your incident response. So say, hey, Did you notice this in the logs? Did you notice this in the net flow? Did Snort generate an alert? What about ArcSight? It's a very cool product, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's talk about purple teams. Does anybody in here self-identify as purple team, by the way? One person? 2 people? 3 people? Excellent. So, the whole point of this was instead of having conflicting objectives between red and blue, right? I was in a lot of conversations where the red teamer was like, yeah, we just totally owned that system. Fuck yeah. Fuck you. And the blue teamers were just kind of sitting around like, well, yeah, but if. And there was a real kind of like conflict going on. So we should probably instead be sitting around singing Kumbaya, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into cliches. But Mudge had a really, really great quote from the B-Sides Detroit 2013 podcast. He said, my idea of hacking is taking the tactics, techniques, and procedures that different threats are using today and using them against our organizations when they have a mature program to understand how our controls stand up when exercised by a sophisticated thinking adversary. There's a key point there. When they have a mature program, if you don't have management buy-in, if your management just doesn't care about security, that has to be your first step before you go any further. Which we'll talk a little bit about on the end, how to get management buy-in. But another important point to note here is that we want to use those same tactics, techniques, and procedures. We want to use watering hole attacks to test our systems. We want to use phishing emails. We want to use these tactics that, one second, APT is using. So basically what we're doing is we're taking the knowledge of our security, we're taking the knowledge of our weaknesses, and we're basically creating a feedback loop. We're taking the weaknesses and telling the blue team, or we're taking the weaknesses, telling the blue team tells the red team their strengths, red team then looks for a way around those strengths, shows the weaknesses to the blue team, and you get this cycle that increases your security. And so what you can do is you can kind of take your teams away from this red versus blue concept to a badass Spartan fighting loads of incoming APT missiles. And I'm not drinking again. But so here are our goals. The first point is we want to create realistic scenarios, right? I mean, we don't want to assume that someone has a grappling hook, is going to grapple into, the friggin' data center, cut through the window with a laser, and get it. That's completely unrealistic. Unless you're, James Bond. Which I don't think anyone in this room is. No offense. But this is going to help with our protective and detective metrics. And then we want to identify how we're going to protect ourselves, test a scenario, and end up testing our environment. And this is how we do it. And this was just the program that we built for the client. And again, you can combine these in any way you want. We combine threat modeling, where I'm at now, with tabletop exercises when they won't let us do a full-on pen test. Because then we can leverage that to the exercise, and then we leverage that vulnerability assessments. But the key is you want to take as wide a range of scenarios as you can, model them out, and then narrow them down to the most likely scenarios and test them where you think you're most vulnerable. So that way you can begin that feedback loop of helping yourself. So how many of you guys played Halo? Great. Love Halo. It was really interesting, too, because every time you play the game, you go in and the enemies were kind of weak and they get stronger and stronger and stronger as you went in, which kind of is the opposite of how we look at our infrastructure today, isn't it? I mean, think about it. We focus so much time on the perimeter that we ignore internals. We've got two-factor authentication, firewalls, VPNs, everything on the perimeter, and we have unauthenticated web services going over HTTP on the inside. How fucked up is that? We want to change. The idea of this is to change the thinking of, we want to keep it very, very strong in the perimeter. We want to have the big boss in the middle of that infrastructure. Where if they get to that and they get past that, then they deserve to have gotten that. So threat modeling requires the least amount of time and effort. I don't know if you guys caught Wolfgang Gorlich's talk right before mine, but he was talking about leveraging threat models into exercises. And real quick, when you want to choose a model, there's a couple that are available. You've got your cyber kill chains of doom, R, registered TM, all that crap from Lockheed Martin that they so lovely copyrighted. You've got you have Stride from Microsoft, which is excellent, but it takes a long time to do. It's a very involved process. Then you have attack paths from MySec. As I used to live in Michigan, was part of MySec. This is what I've been using in the talk. I'm a little biased. But if you haven't seen it, Wolf's talk, I'm not going to rehash this whole talk, but this is what a basic attack path looks like. And you might not need internal reconnaissance. You might just go from external recon to initial breach to achieve objective, if that's your objective. But these are the basic steps in the attack path model. And so an outcome from doing one of these threat models / tabletops is we came up with this. So again, we're going back to that insider threat. Like, well, what happens if they try to exfiltrate data? We didn't notice anything. So we wrote a rule. We wrote a heuristic. I don't know how many of you are familiar with QRadar and Qflow, but that's the product that we use, and so that's why the terminology might be a little different. But we were looking for net flows, specifically net flows that were local to remote, had a flow bias of greater than a certain percentage, and the flow size was greater than 100 megs. And then we could increase the severity and actually page somebody if that was preceded by web access to a known cloud storage device. Because we had the web service, the web proxy, filtering its logs back into QRadar as well, and so we could correlate that. So that's what we mean when we're talking about writing heuristics. But the main point to take away from this is that this is targeting a behavior. This is not targeting black hole exploit kit. This is not targeting Metasploit. This is not targeting Dropbox specifically. It increases the severity. This targets a behavior that is known to be suspicious. That's what we're looking for. So on to tabletops. Do any of you guys do tabletops during your normal work day? Or work week, work month, work year? A few of you, that's good. Well, for starters, you really do need a table that started as a joke, but really, we tried it standing in someone's office once for about 20 minutes, and it just sucked. Nothing got done. But it's slightly more expensive in terms of time. You've got to get a bunch of people together, and you've got to sit down, you've got to talk about what's going on, but it's really safe. And devs love this, because that way you're not actually breaking their application. You're saying, hey, this is what we think we can do. You should probably go look into this before we actually do it. And working for a Fortune 500, we've got dev teams, we've got EH, we have IR, and they love it, because then it's a kind of a way to ease in to the whole idea of pen testing, because it can be really scary for some people. They think it could end their careers. Even though we know we're just trying to help, they think we're there to end their careers, in some cases. So, we modeled the insider threat. We gathered stakeholders and management, and at this point, we had modeled our heuristic of a data upload. And then we found out something really, really interesting. We said, okay, this alert triggered. What are you going to do? Go. Everyone just kind of looked at each other and said, I guess we call the sysadmin? Okay, what's the sysadmin going to do? Shut down the server? That's all they had. And so what we did was we went through and we said, all right, look, this is a major, major problem. And so we sat everyone down and we built out these policies and procedures. We sat down and we said, look, this is who needs to be contacted, and this is what needs to happen every single time this is alerted. This is the sort of investigation that needs to happen. So exercises. Again, these are, getting progressively more expensive in terms of time, just due to the amount of technical work involved. What you do is you take your modeled scenarios, you take your tabletop scenarios, and you take the more likely, the ones that you did kind of poorly on, and you test them. So for example, let's take a look at persistence. What we did is that we tested our ability to connect out. Could we, over a non-standard port, do a netcat connection externally? And then could we pass data through it unadulterated? Or we could do something like this. Any guys familiar with DD? Anybody not familiar with DD? I guess is a better question. So DD, You know what? It'll be easier to just explain the command. What this is going to do is this is going to create a 1.1 gig file of zeros. All right, and actually something really funny happened when we were testing this. We tried to use rsync, and it turns out rsync compresses the file, and instead of uploading a 1.1 gig file, all we saw across the network was like a 1 kilobyte file. It was pretty funny. We couldn't figure out why it wasn't triggering for like 20 minutes. It was terrible. But no, this worked for Dropbox. I mean, the first problem there was that they allowed Dropbox through their web proxy. But yeah, they could just upload file data all day long. And then, unfortunately, this rule triggered a couple times. Any of you guys familiar with lulinks? End of the inter.net? And it's a bad site. Don't go there. So, let's take another example and go back to Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike has this really, really cool feature that was added in June called Malware C2. And what you can do is you can take those beacons that we were talking about earlier, and you can write these configuration files for them. And so you can emulate it to make it look like Zeus, Configure, any worm, any piece of malware that you want, you can make this look like. And, they've got a whole list of, pre-built configuration files on the server. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not being paid by Mudge or Cobalt Strike. I just think it's a really, really cool product. And I think it's key. Well, not key, but it's an excellent tool to use in this particular team. And so assessments, excellent. So assessments are the most expensive, obviously. But what you want to do is you want to create a targeted scenario, right? You don't want to just go in and say, hey, I ran an ARP scan. I found that you're vulnerable to ARP cache poisoning. Congratulations, you're vulnerable. GG. No. You want to attempt to exfiltrate data. You want to attempt to achieve that objective, to test that PT across a specific path. And if you can't, use any path you want to achieve that, but do it. So in this particular example, we had external access and we wanted to exfiltrate data. It was a black box test from a financial institution, and we wanted to get the documents, the PII, mortgages, titles, and all the other loan documents that they held. But they had data loss protection, so they were pretty much set, right? So their objectives were to test again for that insider threat, and then they also wanted to test from the outside. And they had this really cool wireless network set up where they had, guest and a regular, internal. And the internal, you had to have keys and all the fun stuff, but guest was just a single password. So we cracked the guest password in about 15 minutes. It was the company name followed by the year. We were scanning around and we found something really interesting. The DNS server was not an external DNS server. It was internal. And it just so happened that DNS server was also a domain controller. And it just so happened that domain controller had a one-to-one NAT to the guest wireless. And that one-to-one NATed domain controller had RPC nullbind enabled. And we got a list of 900 usernames. And it just so happened 5 of those usernames had the username as the password. And then it just so happened that when we did an authenticated RPC bind, we found a domain admin account with the password in the comments section. Yeah. We did. Yes. So they actually were not upper management. The users were training. I'm changing them up a little bit, but training, setup, so basically for workstation setup, and I forget the other 3, but those were the big 2. And for the rest of the time my engagement there, I used the training account because my account wouldn't work and I couldn't get anyone to change my password. It was pretty bad. But if you notice, each one of these is a pretty small vulnerability. I mean, the one-to-one NAT on the domain controller is pretty fucked up. But in general, these are all pretty small, but they all add up to one big vulnerability. This is what you want to see from your pen test. You don't want to see, hey, I ARP cache poisoned you and was able to crack one of your passwords. Yay. That does nothing for you. Here's example 2, and I just wrote this slide maybe about an hour ago. So our goal in this one was to compromise a workstation through a flash. Watering hole, email, whatever. It was a white box test, so I received the version and the CVE CVE info, and the objective was simply just to get shell. It was going to be very, very difficult because semantic endpoint protection was installed. Super secure. So back to, doing that in about 30 minutes, we demoed this to CERT, and they were able to say, hey, what the hell? And everyone pretty much knows stuff is crap. And I apologize if you work for Symantec, but it didn't really stop anything. But the cool thing about it was that within about 2 hours, we had a soft patch for it. We had signatures written in Snort, set to a certain severity for a certain period of time, until we were able to put out a company-wide patch within the next day. This is an example of an advanced program, where you have SLAs around all your vulnerabilities. CVSS is a great way to wrap SLAs. But again, you need the entire company's buy-in. You cannot do this by yourself. So when you're building your program, you want to start with gathering threat intelligence, and I know that's so just, like everyone says, go get threat intelligence. But at my company, we have a threat intel team. Risk.io, I know is, again, cliche, but it's great for a small business looking to gather some threat intel for their vulnerability management program. You can then move on to threat models, and then you can start doing tabletopping if you want, if you get your manager buy-in. But once you get to that point, you need to start getting EVP buy-in. You need to start building a culture around this. Kai Rower has a great framework called this Building a Security Culture Framework. And I know one of my former clients actually went through it. And they absolutely loved it. But it's something like that. You can also use Steve Fox's communication plan. I know he has he's got his slides online. He's also been recorded by Adrian. By the way, thank you for recording all this stuff. Here's a brief overview of what it is. And yeah, some of them are buzzwords, but they do make sense. You need to make sure your communications are relevant, distinct, credible, benefit-driven, and aligned with strategy. What that means is, does it make sense to the company? Does it go back to that why? Can you explain to your boss, in his terms, where he can understand you, why you're doing this and why this needs to be done? If you just go there and start spouting jargon, he or she's not going to listen to you. She's just going to say, oh, okay, you're just getting worked up about something technical again. But if you can explain how that affects the business and why that's needed, then you have leverage. And this is another slide Stephen sent me, and I think I'm not going to go into it too much. I'll let you watch his talk if you'd like. But it shows the dimensions of actually having a position in a conversation. You need power, timing, benefits, and audience coverage. In other words, make sure you're not talking to your boss at a crap time. If you need budget, don't do it at the end of the fiscal year. Do it at the beginning. If you're a junior employee, don't go to the executive vice president and say you need this done. That sort of thing. I actually made that mistake when I was green at one of my old companies. We were a managed service provider. We had just gone through a breach of one of our clients, and I emailed the director of audit and compliance, and I said, hey, we need to do all of this stuff. I was 3 levels below him. There was me, there was the senior assigned to mentor me, there was the team lead, the manager, actually I was almost 5 levels, and then the director. Don't do that. I highly recommend against it. But again, we go back to this whole point of doing something, right? And I just realized, I don't mean to sound condescending when I say that, because we all want to do something. We all do things every single day. But we want to make sure we're doing the right things, and doing the right things for us. And then we can all be one big happy family. All right, that wraps it up. I know we are ahead of schedule, but I kind of wanted to leave a little bit open at the end for any questions, or, if you guys wanted to talk amongst yourselves about what you guys do, because I've noticed that on the red team there's a lot of communication. We talk a lot. I've talked to my friends, if I'm saying, hey, I've got this really difficult issue going on, but when I was doing blue team, we never talked. We never said, hey, I'm seeing this. Are you seeing the same thing? So that's something else that I kind of tacked this on at the end, that I really want to see happen, is I want to see blue teams talking with each other. I want to see blue teams talking with red teams talking with blue teams, red teams talking with red teams. Communicate. the bad guys are, why shouldn't we? Thank you. Yes, sir. That's an excellent question. I don't offhand. If you like, we can exchange information and I can look that up for you. I've got a couple friends over at HP and I can see if they've got some of those logs. Usually what we did was, actually, no, I take that back. What you can do is that you can take, if you have a Windows box, what we did when we were building a lab, and kind of like the CTF for last year's Secure World, was we created the logs we wanted. We created that that bad behavior, and then I wrote a Python script using Scapy, and you can replay those scripts back into the sim. We were using QRadar at the time. I don't know if it'll work for others, but I know it worked for QRadar. So the Scapy plugin for Python was pretty useful for that. Yes, sir. What the gentleman said was taking your IDS and snort logs and replaying them as well. And that's an absolutely brilliant idea. Yeah, it works very well replaying these logs, especially if you can, when you get them formatted. There's a couple different formats. If you're using QRadar, you want Leaf. ArcSight uses Ceph, and I think the rest of them just use syslog. But don't quote me on that one. Any other questions? Any other trolling? Excellent. Thank you guys. You've been a great audience. I am going to go sleep.